where's the motive? Where's the motive behind these professionals who have to adhere to the law and they don't?
It's hard to say what the ultimate motive is. You have to understand that public education is more of a machine than an art, and they only have so much money. They can only provide so much, and if every child that really should be a special education student with an individualized plan was placed in such a plan, well, then the taxpayers would be paying 5 times as much because it's expensive. It requires more teachers and more services, and there's a limit on how much they're going to get from the taxpayers, and how do you provide the services if you don't have the ability to pay for them?
So they discriminate based on first come, first serve?
Not necessarily. I mean, there's no nexus that can really be found to show that the bean counters are running the show. Okay. But ultimately, that's how it works out. I mean, that's the effect. So it doesn't really matter if that's really their reason, because they cause the same effect, the same problem, which is that a child that needs to have an individualized plan isn't being given one because they're trying to find a way out of it, to find an exception to the rule, and say this child, in this case, Taylor, he's above grade average, so he's fine. But he's not, because for Taylor to even go to school, it has to be challenging and interesting to him, and they don't want it to be challenging and interesting to him because that takes him out of the group. And the group is easier to give instruction to than an individual. It's less costly, it's more efficient, you don't have to spend as much time, you don't have to spend as much money. And when you have to take a child out of that group and deal with that child individually, it takes up more time and more money.
You higher than normal then?
His IQ is superior, but even more so, there's been such an emphasis on IQ, and we know now through the latest and greatest through neuropsychological development that there's just too much emphasis on that number and not enough emphasis on brain plasticity, I believe that's what it's called, which means that that number can move up and down, whereas 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we thought that, if you have an IQ of 100, that's where it's at. Now we know that neuron connections and brains through exercise and stimulation can actually grow, and that number can grow. And there are different type of brain processes that are involved in learning, and that's what our psychologists measured through the cognitive assessment system. And so we're more concerned with how the brain functions, how efficient it is, than the actual IQ number. I mean, we get the IQ number, but it means not that much to us. In terms of Taylor's brain, the 4 areas that we measured, most people's brains are like Volkswagens. This kid's was a Ferrari. I mean, it was just so smooth, just so perfectly connected. It was just a smooth machine. And the other thing in terms of those numbers, when we did test him, he was at a point of distress. And so we do know that even in the most comfortable circumstances, a child or even adult suffering from depression and anxiety, it's going to bring down those scores. So even though his cognitive processes and his IQ were higher than mine will ever be, we have to take into account also he took these tests while he was under psychological distress. And so at best, these can only be estimates, and I would guess it's a lot higher.
And that's my impression too. And the other thing is it's a battery of tests, both at the school level and with the private psychology clinic. The achievement tests rate things in a different way and look at things in a different way than the intelligent quotient tests. So an IQ score only has some application to that individual. You have to take a look at all of the other factors too. And in this case, the achievement scores were showing that he had both the ability and knowledge and capability of learning and performing at a 12th grade or college level in every single course as a 6th or 7th grader.
Wow.
And yet, you know, you can't get hung up on the IQ score.
No.
In this child's case, it was lower than what's considered genius level, but that's, like Gary says, that's a 30 or 40-year-old way of thinking,
Right.
and the IQ test itself only measures certain things in certain ways on a specific day under those conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And given a chance to perform under different conditions on a different day, that score could change, and probably will.
And his achievement scores, as Mr. Flint pointed out, were just extremely high. And on some subtests, they were measured in graduate school level. And
Wow.
this is an 11-year-old child. And you can't really get the full concept of all of this until you really sit down and talk with this child. I met him for the first time a couple months ago in my office, and he came in and just sat down, and literally it was like talking to a 25-year-old.
How fun.
It was interesting.
And he seems to do better in coursework and subjects with individuals like himself or adults, just because the other people are thinking kind of at the same accelerated pace that he is.
Sure.
And based upon Dr. Thompson's test results, for the first time in her career, she put in writing under recommendations that this child needs to go to college. Needs college level work now, not in 6 months, right now.
And that's, in large part, it has very little to do with the IQ and achievement tests, but his individualized situation.
Mm-hmm.
Asperger's kids are very unique, and in his case, he's dual exceptional, which is a whole different thing.
Mm-hmm.
He is both extremely accelerated in the way his brain functions and in the way he thinks and wants to learn. He wants to devour knowledge, and not just regurgitate it, but he wants to devour it, understand it, and be able to apply it.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, he has limited social skills, and those social skills are going to take a lot of modification for them to slowly improve. He may act appropriately in one situation where he feels more comfortable at home. He'll have a meltdown. And that has to be taken into consideration by the school people in making their evaluations and assessments. And instead, they said, well, he's not having problems at school, but he's having problems at home. Home must be the problem.